Well, let me start there. I mean, how did his administration compare to F. Marcos's martial law, for example, and then the one that followed it, the Cory administration, the perspectives there. No? Tell us
Right. I mean,
your look
I'll
at it.
I'll give the more personal, and then I'll give the more political science-ish kind of take on this. On the personal level, I mean, as someone who grew up in Baguio, as Ilocano, right? Usually, we always talk about the Marcoses,
Yeah.
or Ferdinand Marcos, as kind of our great leader or hero and representation. And a part of me was always like kind of skeptical of that, in a sense that not only about the merits of Marcos' regime per se, but I was saying like, well, we had multiple Ilocano presidents. We had Quirino, we had Ramos, among other things. So I went into the background of these different presidents, right? And I felt that in many ways, actually, if you look at the levels of education, in terms of overall impact, etc., I just felt that Ramos, probably is among the better Ilocano leaders we had. And I never understood why this obsession or fascination with the Marcos I mean, I understand it in a certain way, but I still cannot fully absorb it, right? So the other thing is that, of course, I was also in the Philippines. I mean, I lived abroad for a while, but I was in the Philippines in the 1990s. And I remember during that time, there was a lot of optimism about the Philippines as kind of the new rising Asian tiger. And I contrast that a lot with when I entered college in the mid 2000s. During the Arroyo administration, when the Philippines was kind of seen again as sick man of Asia, right? So I could see that contrast, and I could also see the contrast. I mean, during the Estrada administration, I remember when I would go around the region, and I would say I'm from the Philippines, like, oh, Philippines, the actor president, right? So those are some of my personal anecdotes. Not to mention the other personal experiences. When I studied abroad or I did exchange programs abroad, one of the Filipino presidents that they always talked about, kind of like version of Mahathir or Lee Kuan Yew, was actually President Ramos. Kind of like this global leader type. Someone who's well traveled, someone who's very articulate, who has a vision not only for his country but for his region, kind of like an ASEAN elder statesman. So as a student, a teenager and student, those were the kind of experiences I had
Okay.
vis-a-vis the Ramos administration. Now, my take as a political scientist is this: I assess a leader's competence not based on the aura of invincibility that they project, but I assess them based on how much they invest in institutions.
Okay.
And actually, there are objective indicators of whether a leader is doing good or bad.
Okay.
For me, one important indicator is tax effort.
Tax.
Tax effort, because tax collection is one of the greatest also indicators of strength of the state. Because my argument is one reason why the Philippines is not doing as good as a lot of its neighbors is because we have very weak state institutions. Weak in a sense that they're very vulnerable to manipulation by vested interests, by the Ancien regime, and they're also not very strong in terms of their bureaucratic capacity, right? Whereby a lot of times the political appointees tend to overshadow the bureaucrats and technocrats and create frustration and so on and so forth. So I think if you look at tax collection, it's one of the greatest indicators of whether you're having a stronger state. Because tax, by nature, is an involuntary, I mean, it's a coercive exercise. No one wants to
the
really
state,
pay
yeah.
tax out of their pocket. I mean, there are a few of us who may want to do it, but so if a state can collect taxes effectively, that means that that's a strong state, right?
And
that
he
you're
worked
willing
on
to
that.
extract it.
And he worked?
And he worked on that. And if you look at the Ramos administration, our tax effort rates were, I think, 14 to 15%. We only reached that last year. So we went that high, and then under the succeeding administration, it went down, I think, below 11%.
You backtrack.
So that means institutions were damaged in the succeeding administration, right? And only now, after almost 2 decades, we are back, actually almost exactly after 2 decades, we are back to what Ramos already achieved back in the days. There are many other things that I can talk about. The other thing that I think Ramos makes the Ramos administration very unique is, and of course, I'm an avid reader of a person who's on the same page as me in Choir Columnist, as Chelito Habito, Secretary Habito, and Professor Habito. And Professor Habito always talks about the fact that, people like him who were in Ramos' cabinet were neither kamag-anak, neither kaibigan necessarily. Some of them even didn't vote for Ramos, and some of them perhaps even criticized Ramos in the past. And yet they were there in the administration. I think very few people in their right mind can question the fact that the people in the Ramos administration, you didn't have the kind of clownish figure that you tend to see nowadays. People of impeccable integrity and people of tremendous amount of merit in terms of their skills and credentials. And teamwork was one of the things that was always at the center of Ramos administration's way of moving forward. I also talked to a lot of friends who are now in the academe, but they used to work in Malacanang throughout 4 or 5 administration. And whenever I asked them who was the best president in terms of running, the managerial aspect of running Malacanang, sense of predictability and discipline, Ramos will always come on top.
Talaga.
Ramos will always come on top. These are people who were part of the bureaucracy of Malacanang. So they know better than me.
And the bureaucracy is generally a monolithic structure. Huh? Moves at a snail's pace. And their impression, or at least their experience, is that he was able to get that that structure to move
And inspire them. I mean, it was not like coercion. It's not like Ramos scared them to work. Ramos inspired them to work. The fact that Ramos, I believe, is kind of a workaholic. I mean, he reminds me of Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew. I mean, these are guys who never, want to stop. They just keep on going. I think that workaholism was infectious. I think if you're a young bureaucrat, I mean, a lot of friends that I'm talking to are now in their 40s and 50s. They were like in their 20s when they started, when Ramos was there. And they would see, we have a president who actually reads, who actually writes, who actually analyzes, who has all of these kind of competent guys. It actually inspired them a lot. But you can also imagine how dispiriting it was for them. Then suddenly Ramos was followed by someone who's not very known for sleeping, for reading, or sleeping through the meetings. So no offense meant to the other administration, but politics is a relative thing. It's always about a comparison thing. And I think for most people who live through it, who studied it carefully, who have a much more global comparative view like myself, it's very hard to dismiss the fact that Ramos was exceptional in many ways as far as his administration is concerned.
That particular character trait, the work ethic, you're saying, totally influenced his administration, his governance, his management. Is that so?
I mean, no administration is perfect, right? And there were controversies and concerns under the Ramos administration. There's nothing to whitewash about that. Nonetheless, I think if it's a question of how the leader projects himself, what the effect that the leader has on his subordinates, how the leader embodies the values that he talks about, I think Ramos did an absolutely great job. As I said, he was a person who was almost obsessed with his work, right? He was working around the clock. And if you have a boss like that, it's very inspiring, I think, for you to work like that. And, in short, he was a professional. And he had respect for the office of the presidency as an institution. He didn't treat the office of presidency as a personal chair, right? Or a throne, right?
Or a privilege.
Or entitlement, actually. I would use the word entitlement. A lot of Filipino presidents, when they're presidents, they talk as if they embody the institutions on a personal level. It's kind of like, Louis XVI, like l'état c'est moi, I am the state.
No.
You never hear that from Ramos. What you get from Ramos throughout his speeches, and I think behind the scenes discussion, is like, I was the custodian of the office of the presidency. And while I was there, I made sure that I make the least damage and the most positive contribution I can make. So I think in that sense, Ramos was an exceptional leader.
Was it also because of the challenges that he had to face when his administration came in? Tell me about that. Well, what did you see were the challenges, or what were the major obstacles to get him
Right.
on the
So
go?
obviously the 80s were just a decade of transition, right? Transition out of the Marcos regime and into something unknown, right? President Cory tried to transition us out of authoritarianism, but she faced 7, 8, 9 coups, depending on how you count coups, the
Depending on
postmodern
who you're
coups.
talking to.
So, late 80s was, Philippines was a mess. And that's where Lee Kuan Yew comes into the Philippines and lectures us that you have too much democracy. And I think, with all due respect to Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, I think he was absolutely wrong. I think He doesn't appreciate the concept of path dependency. The mess of the past will affect your present and the future. The Cory Aquino administration was paying the price for the mess of the previous administration. So once Ramos comes in 1992, we essentially could go two paths. Return to the past because the Cory administration was still not consolidating power, or consolidate the gains of democratic transition. We went for the latter, not the former, right? In a lot of countries, there's a relapse, authoritarian relapse. Ancien regime comes back. In the case of Ramos, no, he consolidated. I think the fact that President Ramos had a background in the military helped a lot to kind of end the coups, at least while he was in power. So throughout the 1990s, there was barely a coup as far as I know. That was a huge improvement from the 1980s. The second thing is that as he stabilized the political situation, as he made sure that all important political stakeholders buy into the democratic game as the only game in town, then the economy could pick up. As far as the economy is concerned, I think President Ramos also did another thing that is an indication of a strong state. Not strong man, but strong state, which is what we need, not strong men. They do more damage than good over a long time. Was that we open up certain critical sectors that were highly monopolized, right? Telecommunication sectors, the PLDT days, the early days. So he plugged in the Philippines into the 21st century, essentially. That's what he did. We also pushed for a lot of privatization. I don't agree with a lot of his privatization, but the fact is that he was dealing with a lot of badly run state-owned enterprises and state-affiliated companies. But also that era saw some infrastructure build-up. Our growth rate, I think, was around 3 to 4%, 3.5 to 4%. So actually, by the early years of the Ramos administration, we were very much in a takeoff mode. Unluckily for President Ramos, of course, the Asian financial crisis happened in 1997. That's life. Things like that happened. But within the realm of what he could do, I think he did his best with very encouraging results of consolidating the Philippines. The other thing that I like about President Ramos was he was hyperactive internationally. He didn't get the kind of headlines that President Duterte gets. President Duterte gets a lot of headlines, not necessarily for the best reason. But Ramos was very much at the forefront of ASEAN integration efforts, at the forefront of ASEAN being an anchor of pan-regional integration. So he was actually a voice for Pax Pacifica, right? This idea that the 21st century and the end of Cold War should no longer be about either US or China or Soviet Union or Russia. It should be about a shared collective security architecture, right? Or common security. And Ramos was very much active in that. The fact that President Ramos himself is very much articulate in the jargon of security and economic discourse actually was also very helpful. Like, when he talks, he talks out of his own brain. This is not just some staff preparing him stuff, right?
And experience.
And experience, right? And someone who reads, which is not something very, nowadays it's very hard to appreciate that, especially with the kind of leaders you have today. So I think that kind of technocratic reformisting side to President Ramos was very appreciated. The other thing I like about President Ramos is how he pushed back against Lee Kuan Yew. I think this was during the APEC summit or during one of the visits of Lee Kuan Yew when President Ramos was the president. Lee Kuan Yew essentially was making this argument of authoritarian modernization, right? When you're poor developing countries, you cannot afford democracy, move forward to authoritarianism.
The Singapore model.
And Singapore is not even a country; it's a city-state. No offense to those guys. And what works in a city? I mean, as Deng Xiaoping told Lee Kuan Yew, if only I had Shanghai. In fact, Shanghai is even bigger than Singapore by several times. But the point is this. There's a lot to learn from Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew is a great leader in many ways, but I think sometimes he tend to be a little bit hectoring and preachy in ways that I think it was not earned. And President Ramos' response was absolutely brilliant. And actually, I quoted this in a lot of my works. He said something like, why should they be mutually exclusive? You can move towards development and democratization at the same time. And that's exactly what the Ramos administration was doing, at least for the first 3 or 4 years. And I believe the Aquino administration was also doing exactly the same thing. If you look at the Aquino years, you also had booming economy and good governance reform at the same time. So we demolished this myth of authoritarian modernization. And as I always say, for every Lee Kuan Yew you name me, I can name you 12 Mugabes and Gaddafis. Forget about the Mobutus and Marcoses and all, right? The reality is Lee Kuan Yew is an exception. That authoritarian modernization is an epic failure throughout the 20th century for anyone who knows their basics of development and political science. So I think President Ramos was making also very strong intellectual and political argument by pushing back against that kind of, I think, false binary that Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was putting forward. And I appreciate, so essentially, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir tend to talk about Asian values, while President Ramos was talking about the fact that modernization and democracy are not a Western thing. It's a universal thing. Anyone can do that. And in fact, he's absolutely right in historical sense, because the Philippines, even if we are not a Western Caucasian country, we contributed to the development of the Universal Charter on Human Rights in the United Nations. Our people were very much at the center of those activities. So President Ramos was bringing back that part of our history, our liberal traditions, that unfortunately were kind of pushed to the back burner because of the Marcos regime and also now the return of autocratic nostalgia in our country. So I also appreciate. The other thing, of course, was peace agreement with the MNLF. Right? So the Cory Aquino administration, 1987 constitution, we had the ARMM laid out there. But what's the point of ARMM if the major rebel group there is still not in peace with you? So ARMM became reality because we had a peace agreement. Exactly.
Yeah, it was toothless.
So the peace process and the peace agreement with MNLF made the prospect of Muslim autonomy a reality. And now, of course, President Duterte is building on that by creating a much more effective and inclusive version of ARMM. So in many ways, Duterte is building also on the legacy of the Ramos administration. There are lots of other things I can discuss, but I think these are some of the major achievements of the Ramos administration that people tend to forget a lot.
The peace process, well, he gave three attempts, no? The MNLF, the RAM, and the CPP, NPA succeeded in two. They didn't quite get much traction with the left, you know. But 2 out of 3 isn't that bad at all, wasn't it?
Right. Well, the RAM was essentially a coup that almost toppled the Cory regime. So once you get rid of the RAM, you consolidated democracy. That was huge in itself. The MNLF, wow, I mean, he did what Marcos couldn't do, right, after the Tripoli agreement. The communists, sure, there was no final peace agreement, but they were significantly weakened. Not neutralized, but they were significantly weakened. That's why the communists have not been as major kind of armed threat to the Philippine regime over the past 2 decades. So so you isolated and contained a certain threat, and you completely neutralized 2 other threats. That's almost 3 out of 3, I would say, right?
And allowed him. His formula was, peace and development, and in fact, the foundation is named after that. You know, you cannot pursue development if there is no peace, and development cannot happen without
the mutually constitutive nature of that. They build on each other. I think that was a very brilliant kind of. I mean, in academia we talk about that, but there are few politicians of his caliber who talked about that. So I feel affinity. Like, thank God there's a president who talks about this. You know because others are just done matuid or like or drugs, or I don't know. Like, but to have a president like that, speak those things, it's quite happy. I mean, for academics, it gives us giggles. You know, so I feel he's a president that I can talk to him like a fellow, as a colleague, right? And I hope he feels the same way, like in a way that, of course, we are also academics who are engaged in public. So for publicly oriented academics like myself, I think President Ramos is a kindred spirit. Is someone that we felt, who could understand us and who could understand him. And under those very difficult conditions in the early 1990s, I think he did very well. I have a frustration that I feel, in retrospect, his legacy is not as appreciated as it should have, and I understand the reasons for that. But let's not forget that if you look at the SWS surveys, President Ramos was hugely popular in his first 3 or 4 years. His numbers are comparable to Duterte, actually. He and Duterte are actually the most popular presidents we have had in recent memory.
Thus far.
So during his time, President Ramos actually was appreciated by a lot of people, and I think for good reasons, because it was a breath of fresh air from the 1980s mess. And let's not forget, President Ramos actually became president with a very small plurality.
I was going to point that out, actually. Unlike the current tenant in Malacanang, who came in a very, very popular, with a very popular vote, Ramos came in with a plurality with 23%, and he actually had to, reconsolidate the people to him, I'm president, yes, but I want you to know that I'm president of everyone, not just.
Yes, I mean, President Duterte also won by plural. 39% is not the majority, right? But it was a landslide victory.
Exactly.
That gave him the momentum. While in the case of President Ramos, it was a very close call, right?
And it was challenged, in fact.
And it was challenged, and there are still debates about that. This is the Philippines. Either you win or you're cheated, right? So that's just how it happens. Especially if it's a close call, as it was. But there are two ways to deal with a problem like that. You act as if that's not the case, and then become more authoritarian, kind of in denial mode, or you say, I accept it. I won by a slim margin. But guess what? My solution is I step up to the plate. I will create a coalition government and reach out to all important sectors. And that's exactly what President Ramos did.
What he
So
did.
when he couldn't he did his best to be popular. That's the best he could do during elections. But it's what he did after the elections that I think is even much more important, of reaching out, creating an inclusive government, right?
Let me point out a few of the tactics, if you can call it that. I mean, out-of-town cabinet meetings, bringing the palace to the field, assigning cabinet officers for regional development, and then to be able to get the legislative mill running. He created the LEDAC, Legislative Executive Development and Advisory Council.
Right.
And that's where the issues actually were fleshed out in lieu of, lengthy debates on the floor or on committee level at least. No? So even that was, you can say he was lucky, but that wasn't really luck. That was a very purposive effort.
Right. Well, which just shows that the President Ramos' position was, we live in a democracy with separation of powers, with checks and balances, but that doesn't mean we have to have adversarial relations among different branches of the government. We can work on shared concerns and common interests, which is a far cry from how some of his successors work, which is essentially us versus you, good versus bad, this color versus that color.
Right.
So that divisiveness versus that kind of coalition, dialogue, pluralistic base of approach, breath of fresh air, sometimes I cannot but feel certain sense of lamentations. Like in the 1990s, we already had a formula to move forward. What happened, right?
Yeah.
So
Why didn't we learn?
why didn't we learn? Because it was working. It was working. I think this, I'll be honest, I'm quite skeptical of the whole federalism discussion for, social science reasons. There's just no way you can convince me, because the literature doesn't prove that this will work. But I also believe that there's certain fundamental problems with our constitution. 6 years single term is too long for a bad president, because you cannot impeach presidents in the country, because the power of the purse is constitution with legislature, but actually with Department of Budget Management. So you're not going to get impeached because you can essentially have a leash on the Congress. So EDSA becomes the only option. But 6 years is too short for a good president. I really believe it's too short. How I wish we had the Indonesian model of 5 years. Imagine if Ramos...
5 year, no.
Imagine if Ramos had the whole 1990s to himself, and that model of governance was institutionalized. It could have completely changed our trajectory by the 21st century. Most likely, our past two presidents would not have come to power at all. It would be a completely different trajectory. I can already think of the counterfactuals. What kind of guys could have won after Ramos? That, I think, was one of the greatest tragedies. That I think the 1987 Constitution was so obsessed
87.
with avoiding another Marcos that it foreclosed the possibility for giving enough time for good kinds of leaders to lay down the foundation for long-term national development. That's where I have a problem with the institutional design of the 1997 Constitution, and that's where I believe we need really amendments. So I think Indonesia is doing better job than us. SBY and Jokowi are getting 10 years at least. I think most likely Jokowi will win his re-election. So that gives them ample amount of time to consolidate. SBY, for instance, Cecilio Bambang Yudhoyono, he consolidated the Reformasi, the transition,
Right.
and Jokowi now is putting Indonesia into the global picture as a G20 legitimate global power. So they are two more or less decent, if not good leaders. And look at where Indonesia is. They're probably ahead of us already in democracy. If you look at indicators, they're ahead of us in a lot of different indicators. So imagine if we had something like that. And we were already ahead of Indonesia in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So this is not only about Ramos. This is about a model that Ramos was experimenting with sensible results, and for some reason was just abandoned after Ramos. This is where my frustration comes in, right? So I think President Ramos gave us a glimpse of what will work in the Philippines. A technocratically competent, reformist kind of leadership. And I don't know, President Ramos has, what, 3 masters? Someone who's also believes in lifetime learning, because one of the problems we have with certain leaders is that when they reach a
stop.
certain age, they don't want to listen. Like, I know my stuff. They want to rule by instinct. But this is modern age. This is not the medieval times, for heaven's sakes. The challenges are so complex. I always tell, my students and friends, if one day I wake up and I become the president, let's say, hypothetically, the first thing I'll do is I'll gather the smartest Filipinos from around the world and do big data analysis. Because I believe a single brain, no matter how smart, cannot comprehend, forget about solving, the kind of challenges we're facing today. And I think Ramos gave us a glimpse that Ramos accepted. I may be great in many ways, but I'm not going to be enough. I need help. We need to work together. The problems are too complicated.
And that's what he did.
That's
He put
exactly
people
what he
together,
did.
task
And he was doing this
forces.
in the 20th century.
Correct,
When in fact,
correct.
that model is even more fit for the current century with climate change, artificial intelligence, South China Sea disputes, ang dami natin problema. So I hope the Ramos model of governance will come back.
Let me get back to, you already started it, a discussion on the economics, but that was really something early on, actually. In the campaign, I was looking at my notes from the campaign. It was liberalization, globalization, and competitiveness. That was the tripod on which Philippines 2000 was anchored on.
Right.
And incidentally, Philippines 2000 on its own, diba, was a vision. So,
Right.
tell me how that addressed the challenges and how it worked.
Well, I will be honest. I have certain skepticism with neoliberalism, and that skepticism I think is gaining strength right now. Whether it's global financial crisis or now with this rise of protectionism in US and all. But in hindsight, this is quite clear. But I believe in the early 1990s, when the Cold War ended and everyone was talking about peace dividend, I won't blame that there were folks inside the Ramos administration, the president himself, saying maybe opening up is the way to go. And again, let's not forget, the background was during the Marcos period, right?
Everything was controlled.
Everything was controlled. So the idea was probably you have to try something else, right? So I don't fully endorse the kind of privatization, the whole neoliberal package, but I understand where it was coming from, right? I just hope that there were tweakings and much more adjustments over time, not only by the Ramos administration, but by other countries. But you could also say that liberalization makes sense when you're talking about a country where you have completely oligopolistic practices in strategic sectors, whether it's electricity,
exactly
utilities.
it.
Exactly. So this is also my problem with the leftist progressive friends, including some of my mentors. Right? It's like blanket dismissal. My take is much more practical. I believe in each stage of economic development, you need certain packages of policies, and you just have to. So one of the guys I look up to when it comes to emerging markets, which we are, is Ruchir Sharma, who leads the $700 billion fund of Morgan Stanley.
Yep.
He's an Indian guy who knows how countries like the Philippines operate. He knows his stuff, and his argument is that every 5 to 10 years, you need a new policy cycles to fit your levels of economic development.
Yep.
So what works for you at the GDP per capita of 1,500 to 2,000, which was the case under Ramos, will no longer work once you reach upper middle income, which is where we are today, $4,000 per capita. So I also understand that probably at that level, certain level of opening in this area maybe made sense. But it's not a package that will work throughout space and time and universally in all sectors, right? So as I said, I have a conditional endorsement of that with the appreciation of the specific challenges that the Philippines was facing.
At
And I
that
believe the
particular
debates
time.
miss that, because you essentially have two kinds of debates. Some former professors in School of Economics were arguing that you want to go back to the Marcos years of bankrupt, crony capitalism. And then you have the leftist argument of saying, oh, you open up, you killed our domestic industries. Forget about how efficient they were,
Yeah.
right? And I think the reality is somewhere in between,
Somewhere in the-
right?
yeah.
And that's where you need heterodox economics, kind of something that you tweak here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Ramos models provides room for heterodox economics,
Mm-hmm.
you know? I don't think people like Celito Habito, among other things, were actually blind neoliberal guys. I think they were also very practical
Right,
guys
right.
who look at realities on the ground. And I believe if President Ramos
Practical,
was
common
followed
sense.
by a good administration similar to him, or if he had 10 years and then he will hire another cabinet in this second term, I'm sure it was a flexible enough model to make those kinds of adjustments. Again, maybe I'm being a little bit counterfactually optimistic, but I think it makes sense in so many ways. Yeah, this is my problem. You have to understand policies of each administration in their own times, based on the challenges, on things that they inherited from the previous administration. And for someone who does history, who writes about history and writes about these development issues, I completely understand why we made certain decisions at that point in time. Yeah.
Let me get back to the portion, you touched on it as well, foreign relations. We just lost the basis. Our single largest foreign partner, ally, the relationship with them was in shambles because we threw them out. We didn't know where we were in our neck of the woods, but this guy stepped in, and as you said, suddenly took the helm and became a voice for the region,
Right.
and one who was listened to.
Right. Voice for middle powers of the region, right? Particularly ASEAN, right? That's a very important thing that President Ramos did.
APEC, ASEM,
Right.
the Asia, ASEAN, Europe, ASEAN strengthening ASEAN, and suddenly brought in, if you remember, ARF,
Of course.
the regional forum, where security issues could be discussed.
Although the Chinese also proposed the ARF, there was, the foreign minister of China back then was
Yeah.
actually very supportive of this.
And engage China.
Right.
No?
Right.
At the time when
Right.
they were, flexing their muscles in the now West Philippine Sea.
I mean,
Tell me your take
Yeah.
on on how he used foreign relations as a tool for,
Right.
national policy, national interest, national security.
well, I mean, my primary specialization is really the South China Sea disputes and foreign policy, right? That's what I'm known for. That's where my books and a lot of publications come from. Now it's like I'm writing on everything practically. But the thing is, my fascination with the Ramos administration really started with the foreign policy issue, because I believe the Ramos administration, and this is where actually I'm more confident in the Ramos administration rather than anything else. I believe he got the foreign policy right more than anything else and more than anyone else.
Yeah.
Probably the only exception I would make is we did not upgrade and maintain our facilities in Pag-asa back then. That's one of the
That's good.
frustrations I had. And we didn't put the lighthouse we were planning Scarborough Shoal. But I know about the internal issues there. But nonetheless, putting that aside, and I'm glad the Duterte administration is finally doing that. Thanks so much to Delphin Lorenzana and our patriots in the AFP. The thing is this. What President Ramos did was what I call bi-multilateralist approach. Again, going back to this false binary. Multilateral no. You do it both at the same time. This is exactly what Vietnam does, right? They engage China head to head, but at the same time they engage ASEAN. At the same time they bring US and India. They even use Russia against China. I mean, that's dynamic foreign policy. And President Ramos kind of had that. I mean, on one hand, he had karaoke diplomacy with President Jiang Zemin. He visited China. He put the Chinese on the spotlight. Well, why are you developing an army? So he played that bilateral engagement card very effectively, which some of his successors did not learn much from. But at the same time, he was smart enough to realize that, well, the U.S. basis thing is not going to come back. Constitutionally, it's not going to be allowed. And Americans also had second thoughts after the whole volcano issue. And Americans were also thinking of withdrawing. So there was also isolationism coming in the U.S. Kind of policy mindset. But the president, through the VFA, right? He threw out the idea of the VFA, and eventually that came into fruition in 1998. The idea was we don't need to bring back American bases, the whole package. Perhaps we can bring back the baby without the bathwater, and the baby is some sort of American forward deployment presence here,
Yeah.
right? So the bathwater of bases is gone, but the baby of American semi-latent deterrence is there, right? Our alliance. So that was very smart. And at the same time, he also worked within the ASEAN. And I think if you look at the Declaration and Conduct Parties in South China in 2002, the efforts were started during Ramos' time.
Yeah.
1997, 1998, we were already having ASEAN-level discussions on the Code of Conduct and DOC, which later on we brought the Chinese on board. This was done during Ramos.
Yeah.
This is not an Estrada diplomacy.
No,
This
no.
is a Ramos diplomacy facing its culmination during the Arroyo administration, right?
Introduced it, in fact, and took advantage of the Philippines chairing.
Exactly. And then you have also the AFP modernization. So you move on 4 fronts at the same time to deal with one challenge. My problem is over the past 10 years, less than past years, our policy is either engage China or either confront China. And I think that's a false binary. You have to engage China where you need to. China is a geographic reality. America is a geopolitical anomaly. You have to face that. You cannot not talk to China. You have to talk to China. But you also cannot, you should not acquiesce to China. You should not bow down to China, even just rhetorically. What you need to do is to engage China, but make the red lines clear and leverage our alliance with US. You know, I remember when President Duterte talks about independent foreign policy, and he's kind of understanding independence, essentially anti-US, more leaning towards the East.
Yeah.
President Ramos was very clear. He said, we don't need independent per se, but interdependent foreign policy. Because we have to understand we are part of a network of relations, right? And how do we leverage these relations? That's where you create independent space, autonomy. I think, again, that was a very brilliant work. I'm sure it's also his staff, not alone thinking. So it's really the Ramos team. I'm not talking about President Ramos. It's the whole Ramos team that is very impressive to me. That I hope we have that kind of leadership again. And I hope people of my age, the millennials, right? You know, a lot of us, it seems we know more about Marcos' time than Cory and Ramos or Erap. You know, it's very frustrating. I believe we have to talk more about the Ramos period because this was a critical area. I mean, if President Ramos did not do what he did, it's very possible that we relapse back to an Entran regime or kind of a semi-anarchy because the 1980s were a complete mess.
Yeah.
There was no assurance that the country will come together. Our economy was in shambles. We had coups back and forth. The loyalists of the previous regime were still there. The oligarchs and liberals who took over were not necessarily the most competent people, right? So Ramos actually did a huge service for the post-Marcos regime.
Let me get to a few issues that were raised against him during his administration. Let me start with the Boys Club. And I'm referring to nothing much of a change there in the bureaucracy. While, as you pointed out, he did pick the right people in the cabinet, but there was still a very significant number of former military officers. And yeah, he just waited for them to get into retirement and then he'd put them in. So it was still a militarized bureaucracy.
Okay, so I'm working on a big paper on civil-military relations under the current administration because you probably have the most number of 2, 3, 4-star generals in this administration than any other I can know on earth, probably with the exception of Burma and some of these military regimes, right? So it's nothing new. It seems there has been a tradition like that. Well, my point is this. I have, again, a very nuanced take on this. First of all, President Ramos is from the military background. So obviously in your cabinet, you have to have a certain level of comfort and confidence. If you're going to experiment and put people who are not really from your circle, you have to have enough people from your circle that you feel you have strategic depth, right? So I understand the psychology of that. The second issue is there were, 7, 8, 9 coup d'etats under the Cory administration. I'm not apologizing for the militarization of the cabinet, but it's very understandable that if you want to consolidate democracy, you need people from the military and defense establishment to buy into the system. So probably by bringing the better elements of the military into the democratic institutions, you somehow secured its survival and consolidation, right?
Neutralize the threat.
So, exactly. So as they say, keep your enemies close, and keep your friends close, enemies close. I'm not saying the military was an enemy, but it's always good to keep the military closer, especially if there are factionalism and questions in the military about whether we have to accept the democratic regime or not.
Okay.
So this is the second. The third thing is this. If military guys are assigned to certain positions in the government, it depends on a case-to-case basis, because some positions in civilian institutions may require the managerial skills that the military guys already have, right? So we can debate about what these things are, but theoretically speaking, the kind of personal discipline, education, etc. that you get in the military is not necessarily anachronistic in the civilian realm. The fourth thing is there are people who work in the military with the military culture, but are actually also very flexible and dynamic, right? I've known a lot of them now. There are people, who are now in the military, and I believe if they join the civilian government, I'll be comfortable working with them as a civilian, as a fellow civilian. Because there are also military guys who are not completely as uptight all the time. They can actually work and engage. Because in democratic civilian institutions, the culture is much more horizontal than vertical. It's consultative, multi-stakeholder. And there are military guys who can actually do that, right? And the last thing we have to keep in mind is military folks are also known for decisiveness. And when you're in period of consolidation or transition and difficulties, decisiveness probably is even more important than your decision making sense. Because even if you have a right decision, but you're so whimpering and you're unsure, that is not helpful. So I think decisiveness is also very important during that time. Nonetheless, of course, as a civilian myself, as a Democrat myself, I'm never completely comfortable with having too many generals there. There are, of course, Department of Defense, I'm comfortable with having defense military guy. But actually in other countries like India, I think among other things, usually you don't put people from military, right? So there are cultures that are very sensitive about that. But America is not like that. So we're more like Americans. So there are certain departments I'm quite okay with having military guys. But to have 7, 8, 9 cabinet ministries, all military in areas that are probably not necessarily tugma or compatible with military, I may have certain problems with it, but it's really a case-to-case basis thing. I don't want to pass judgments right off the bat. So that's why I'm saying you cannot have blanket categorical judgments. You have to really look at the case on a case-to-case basis. But thank you for raising that question. And I have to be honest, yes, I'm not very comfortable having too many military guys there, especially in cabinet positions that are not defense-oriented.
Getting things done, especially during the early years, maybe the first year up to about midstream, third year. He governed via EOs, AOs, MCs, because the legislative process was just a bit too slow for him. I mean, he did have LEDAC, but it did take a while to get the needed laws, legislation, and the structure for it in place. So in lieu of it, he threaded a very thin line there.
Our problem is not partisanship. Our problem is just the nature of our legislature. 70% of our legislature are people from political dynasty background, people with extreme vested interest. Right? I'm not even going to question their integrity and everything like that. So when you're dealing with the Congress like that and you want to really move the country forward, unfortunately, sometimes you have to work around it. I don't think executive order is unconstitutional. It raises some questions about executive or imperial presidency, but I don't think it was unconstitutional. It was within the boundaries of constitution. As far as I know, I haven't seen any ruling against that. And probably it's also a reflection of the fact that we don't have the most credible, reliable legislature in the world, right? Let's not forget, the reason why the Marcos dictatorship was popular in the first few years was precisely because there was a frustration with the Congress that didn't want to pass any decent law on taxation, on necessary reforms, and yet the Supreme Court was also not doing a very good job, right? That is why actually in initial years, the Marcos dictatorship was quite popular because they felt that you need someone to shake up the system. In fairness to President Ramos, he went executive order. He didn't go declare martial law, and he didn't force the point for a charter change. Right? So he just moved close to the cliff, but he didn't jump, right? There was a temptation, but he didn't jump, right? And I think that means that there was a degree of restraint, even though he was treading very tricky, dark waters, right? So I'm not endorsing imperial presidents or executive, but under certain conditions, I'm willing to accept that as a last resort.
Okay. Uh, the structure of Philippine politics. Did he bring stability back? Because it's still personality based. He was hoping to do that.
Right.
And well, instead of going back to the old two-party system, he actually supported a multi-party
Right.
coalition building. That one. But has it gotten us anywhere?
Well, this is where I'll say, there are good stuff and not so good stuff. I mean, the fact of the matter is that President Ramos himself, the way he ran for presidency, was not necessarily within the boundaries of party discipline, right? He didn't get the endorsement. He made his part.
Yeah.
So there's that part.
Yeah, exactly.
His track record is not the best when it comes to respecting party lines. So I'll be very honest about that. But he had to do what he had to do probably, and he felt he's the only guy who could have saved the Cory legacy of democratic transition. Okay, I get that. And I just have to be honest about that. There are problems with our constitution. For instance, sometimes, I mean, all due respect to the guys who drafted it, but what the hell were they doing? Couldn't they think about self-executory provisions against political dynasties? It's common sense in political science that you put things like anti-defection laws. Yung mga tipong, hindi ka pwede magpalit-palit ng partido right away. You will get punished for that in other countries. You can get suspended from politics for a while.
Yeah.
Things like that are just not in the Constitution, and I don't understand why. It doesn't matter you're two-party, three-party, no party. There should be some degree of inbuilt incentives for party discipline or against party defection. I mean, butterfly effect na meron tayo. So, he already inherited that problematic situation. Nonetheless, what I most admire about President Ramos is how he kind of did a Mandela. He did not get any of his children into politics. So he set a personal example. So he had a failure, I would say, in terms of dealing with the systemic problem of personalized politics or dynasties, which are essentially our political parties, right? But at least on the level of person, he showed to us, he has brilliant, people in his family. I know a lot of these people in person. They're brilliant people. I would rather have them in positions. But he made it very sure, together with former Senator Shahani, they made sure that the children will not enter politics. So brother and sister set an extremely great example, which is almost Mandela level example. Mandela in South Africa wanted to do the same thing. He said, Mandela's position was, I don't want to come here and say, we'll replace the whites, but the blacks will do the same kind of, corrupt politics and all. So at least on his personal level, he set an example that we don't want personalistic politics. We don't want people getting voted because they have the name of a former president or they have the connections and resources. So on that, I think he deserves to get credit on that. Again, compare it to other presidents. One whose mother was also a president, one whose daughter wants to become the president, one whose son is at least a senator. Again, it's a breath of fresh air again. Again, you can see the Ramos exceptionalism there. That again, I feel is not appreciated enough.
Let me take a look at, was it just too big a plate? Was it just too full a plate?
Yes. 6 years is not enough. I'm sorry. I don't think any leader, it's so hard to imagine he could have done more than he did. I mean, again, it's not to excuse. I'm sure there are a lot of things that could have been avoided or done, but the inheritance was just mind-bogglingly difficult. The inheritance is mind-bogglingly difficult. The same way that I would say the current administration had also a very good inheritance from the previous administration. That, I mean, if you look at, essentially, he was dealt a bad hand. The cards that were given to him were not the best cards, and yet I believe he did the best with the limited kind of ace cards that he had, which is a very different case from some of his successors, right? I think President Arap had very good cards when he came in. No, I mean, out of the Asian financial crisis, but there were a lot of good reforms that were laid down. I think President Duterte, for instance, is getting a lot of positive from the Aquino administration.
Yeah.
The same way the Aquino administration benefited a lot from a lot of macroeconomic reforms of our administration. That was not the case with Ramos. There was not much positive in there, except
start with
the most important thing, which is a democratic institution.
Space.
That's the best thing. But everything else was hollow, completely hollow.
I guess it was also because do you think it was an opportune time as well that we elected an engineer in
Actually,
92?
I have a bias
that
for
kind
engineers.
Of,
Yeah.
frame of mind.
I have a bias for engineers, right? I'm always skeptical of lawyers becoming presidents. I like professionals a lot, engineers and doctors. I mean, President Ramos was not only an engineering background, he did a lot of master's program in different social sciences. So he's actually, I won't use the word renaissance man, that's probably a bit too much, but he's actually a very versatile, well-rounded person. Yeah.
Did he fail? You think he failed in succession planning? I mean, he wasn't quite sure, no, at the onset who to endorse, no. Eventually settled for Joe de Venecia, but that wasn't enough to counter the immense popularity of Joseph Estrada.
Right. Well, I mean, some people are saying maybe Arroyo could have run also back in that day. She was
She
a
did,
fresh.
but she slid down,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, she was still a fresh senator, everything like that. Well, I mean, Arab was a phenomenon. Arab was also lucky because, in a way, the Ramos brand was also a little bit less popular towards the end because of the explosion in the crime rates and kidnappings and the Asian financial crisis. So Estrada kind of came in as kind of a savior, like in his movies, like, we're having a good and now it's bad, so you need someone like me. So I don't know, maybe the Catholic in me will say God wanted someone like Arab to win. I don't know. But the thing is this, let's just be honest. Elections tend to be anti-incumbent in the Philippines. Tell me one anointed successor who won. I mean, whether it's Mar Rojas, whether it's Gibo, whether it's De Venecia. Well, Estrada didn't have really much of a chance, but for some reason it doesn't work. Or, Marcos probably wanted his son to, or Imelda, or whatever. So for some reasons, Filipinos tend to turn every presidential elections into kind of an anti-incumbent referendum on the previous administration. So maybe Ramos really didn't have much of a political capital to really, put his thumb on the scale at that point in time.
Did the Pirma and People's Initiative also have an impact on that?
Wasn't it a bit too late? I mean, I think, that issue should have been raised much earlier. But again, I can understand where Ramos was coming from. It's like, it's going to raise a lot of eyebrows, right? You win with the plurality. Within first 2 years, you're suddenly saying, I want to change the constitution, which is exactly what this administration is doing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how can people not think that you're going to bring it back to some sort of dictatorship? And actually, during 1990s, you were not too away from the people power, right? So I just don't think people had the appetite for it. And the fact that President Aquino, was against it very openly, I think there was not much room for that, to be honest. There was not much room for that.
And then also Cardinal Sin. So
exactly. There's just no way. He just couldn't. I mean, I'm sorry. Yep. And the thing is this, I mean, that's what being an unconditional Democrat is. You're willing to accept whatever the result is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're a conditional Democrat. And by nature, you're not a Democrat. So, in a way, I think that's also what previous administration is doing with this administration. Like, President Aquino may not be happy with the result, but he had to accept the result because that's the will of the people, right? Yeah.
Is it too early to make a call on FBR's achievements and his place in Philippine
No, I
history?
think 20 years is already enough. I think it would have been still difficult for me to make all of these assessments, let's say during EDSA DOS or in the Arroyo time. But 20 years in, and finally the Philippines is finding its footing again. We're finally a legitimate emerging market. We're finally getting some international profile. And you were thinking, gosh, we already had that 20 years ago. What happened? What happened in that interval, right? That's where I think we have enough benefit of hindsight and comparison to assess President Ramos. So I think, if I'm going to use that kind of analogy, like the French system, I think this is a perfect time. Not to mention, President Ramos is already 90, right? And people are already writing about legacies of Lee Kuan Yew. Mahathir apparently is still not giving up.
He's still
He
writing.
still wants to have the last say. But Ramos belongs to that generation of the last great statesmen of Asia.
Oh, I know.
That's it. I will call them even the titans of Asia.
So the achievements are still relevant to this day. And the other thing is, you may have said it already, we should have drawn a lot of lessons from what he did. You know?
Right. So, so when I wrote that column, why Ramos was the best, right? The intention was not just to praise President Ramos. The intention was to tell people what leadership we need for years and decades to come, right? You could also see it as an implicit criticism of the current administration, or even the previous administration for that matter, because the previous administration was also very much known for being self-righteous, and President Aquino was not necessarily the most well-traveled guy, or, very different kind of mindset from President Ramos, I would say. They were much more cliquish. So I'm actually telling fellow Filipinos, fellow millennials, that we don't need to look for models outside the country.
Outside, yeah.
I don't think we already have that model now. I'm not very happy about a lot of things I'm saying. You don't need to whitewash the Marcos dictatorship to kind of imagine something out of nothing. We already had something more or less good and decent. And I think the Ramos administration provided us a glimpse of that. So Ramos already, ironically, a 90-year-old person provides us a model of what we should do for the new generation, millennials. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. As
Maraming
always.
salamat.